The frost came early to Harlan Flats that October. She felt it through the soles of her boots when she stepped off the road and into the field. The ground hard and pale at the edges, the grass lying flat where the night had pressed it down. 6:15 in the morning. The sun barely clearing the ridge to the east, throwing long shadows across everything. She had read the county ledger entry twice the night before, the way she always did. Frame barn, eastern parcel, constructed 1846. Cedar post, stone foundation. Condemned for removal, crews scheduled. 3 days. She had 3 days. The barn came into view as she crested the low rise, and she stopped. The ledger had not prepared her for the scale of it. Not the height. The roof had settled at one end and the whole structure leaned slightly south, the way old things did when they had been standing through enough winters. It was the width. The barn was wide and set wrong. She stood for a moment and looked. Every barn she had surveyed was placed the way a man plans a thing, centered on the lot, balanced, the foundation lines running true to the property markers on all sides. This one wasn't. She could see it from 30 feet away, before she had even pulled out a measuring rod. The western wall. It ran out past the tree line on that side, past the natural break of the land, past any practical reason. She opened her kit bag and walked toward it. The foundation stones along the west face were the same age as the rest. The mortar had grayed the same way. The lichen had spread uniformly. Nothing had been added later. This was how it was built. Whoever laid this foundation laid it this way deliberately, in 1846, and nobody in the 37 years since had written down a reason. She pulled her measuring rod and set the first mark in the dirt. 2 feet. The western wall ran 2 feet farther out than any framing logic would require. She measured it twice, moved the rod, measured again. 2 feet of extra foundation, solid set, carrying no more structural weight than the original line would have. She wrote the figure in her field book, underlined it once, and looked up at the barn. The morning was very quiet. A magpie somewhere in the cottonwoods to the north. The frost ticking as it loosened from the grass blades in the growing light. And beneath that, she was not certain. A sound that might have been water, or wind finding a gap in the boards, or simply the settling of a structure that had been standing longer than anyone alive in Harlan Flats could remember. She moved along the foundation toward the southeast corner to pick up the next measurement. 3 days. She pressed her pencil to the page and kept working. She had the southeast corner measured and the northwest corner half done when she heard the wagon. It came up the access road from the south. A single horse, no hurry. She did not look up immediately. The figure of a man stepped down from the bench, tied the horse to the fence post at the edge of the lot, and stood for a moment, looking at the barn. He had a carpenter's build, not large, but nothing wasted. He wore a canvas coat the color of dry grass and carried nothing with him when he walked toward the structure. No tools, no ledger. This was the kind of man who looked before he measured. She kept her pencil moving. He walked the perimeter at a pace that was slower than a foreman's inspection and more deliberate than a stranger's curiosity. She noted that he did not start at the door the way most men did. Most men went to the door, opened it, made their assessment from the threshold. He started at the northeast corner and moved with the foundation, counterclockwise, his eyes dropping to the stonework every few feet. She moved her measuring rod to the next mark. He reached the western wall. She did not look up directly, but she was watching. He stopped at a point roughly in the middle of the run, not at a corner, not at a structural juncture, just at an ordinary stretch of laid stone, and placed his right hand flat against the wall. He moved it slowly to the left, following a seam she had already noted in her field book. A seam that ran horizontal, lower than the others, at a depth that suggested a different laying session or a different mason. His fingers stopped. He pressed once, lifted his hand and looked at the stone beneath his palm, the way a man reads a word he was not expecting to find in a familiar text. Then he straightened, looked at the ground for a moment, and kept walking. She wrote down her measurement. He completed the circuit and came to stand perhaps 20 feet from where she was crouched at the northwest corner. He looked at the barn wall above her, not at her. She stood and moved the rod to the next position. Neither of them spoke. After a time, he walked to the door, lifted the latch, and went inside. She heard his footsteps on the board floor, unhurried, a slow traverse of the interior. She heard him stop. He was in the southeast corner. She knew this because his footsteps stopped exactly where the sound had been, that low, steady thing she had not been certain about. He stood there long enough that she counted it. 43 seconds. Then he came back out, set his hand on the doorframe briefly as he passed through, and returned to his wagon without looking in her direction. She wrote nothing for a moment. Then she wrote. He heard it too. She was still crouching at the northwest corner when she heard the side door open. Not the main door. The side entrance, lower and narrower, the one that faced the creek path. The hinges were loose and gave a particular two-note complaint, and she had cataloged it in her notes already. Side entry, east-facing, hardware failing, upper pin. She looked up. The boy who came through was 9, maybe 10. He had the easy, unself-consciousness of a child cutting a path he had cut 100 times. A shortcut that existed in his private map of the town, regardless of what the property lines said. He was carrying a stick and wearing one boot with a broken lace. He did not see her immediately. When he did, he stopped. She did not move. She kept her pencil on the page and waited. He looked around the barn the way children do when they are checking whether they are in trouble. Not ashamed, just calculating. Then he decided something and kept walking. His path took him directly toward the southeast corner. She watched. He slowed before he reached it, stopped, looked down at the boards the way she had looked at that western wall the first morning. The look of someone who already knows something and is checking whether it is still true. He knelt and pressed his ear flat against the floor. She put down her pencil. He stayed like that for a long moment, one palm flat against the boards, cheek to the wood, eyes open and looking at nothing in particular. Then he sat back on his heels. She said quietly, "What do you hear?" He looked over at her without surprise, as though her voice had been expected. "It sounds like it's breathing," he said. He said it the way children report facts, without emphasis, without expecting to be believed, simply putting the information down and leaving it there. She crossed the barn and crouched beside him, put her own ear to the floor. The sound was low and continuous, not rhythmic in the way breath is rhythmic, not a mechanical thing, not anything the boards themselves would make. It was even, patient. It came from below in the way water comes from below, indifferent to whether you heard it or not. She stayed down longer than she intended. When she straightened, The boy was gone. The side door was still swinging. She found the exact spot on her survey sheet, southeast quadrant, approximately 4 feet from the corner wall, and drew a small circle. Wrote 3 words beside it, sound from below. Then she stopped writing and looked at the mark for a while. Outside, the sky was going copper. She gathered her things and walked back to her room on Alderman Street and ate supper without tasting it and lay in the dark with the sound still in her ear, low and steady, like something patient that had been waiting a long time for someone to finally lie down and listen. She was there before the light was full. The eastern sky still held pink at its edge when she pushed through the side door, her survey bag over one shoulder, the notebook already in her hand. The barn smelled of old timber and something cooler underneath, the kind of cold that comes from ground, not air. She went straight to the western wall. She had thought about it through the night, the off-center foundation, the 2 feet of extra width on the west side that no practical framing required. She had drawn it a dozen times on the blank margins of her survey sheets, trying to imagine what a builder in 1846 would have needed an extra 2 feet of foundation for. Storage, she had told herself. Structural miscalculation. A second thought partway through. All the explanations that would let her close the notebook and sleep. None of them had held. She started at the north end of the western wall and worked south. Her hand moved across each stone in turn, slow, flat-palmed, the way you check a surface for heat before you commit your whole hand to it. The stones were set well. Whoever built this wall knew the work. The mortar was old but not failed, gray-white and hard as the stones themselves, and the joints were close. She worked down 18 inches, 3 feet, 5. Then at roughly chest-height on the wall, approximately in the center of that extra 2 feet of foundation, her hand stopped. The stone was the same color as those beside it, the same rough texture, the same general dimensions. But it did not meet the surface quite the way the others did. There was no gap in the mortar. There was no visible seam. What she felt was simpler than that. The stone did not push back the way the others did. It had given it, a fraction of give, like a door that is not fully latched. She pressed it again. It moved. Not much. Not dramatically. It shifted perhaps a 1/4 inch under sustained pressure and stopped, held there by the weight of the stones around it, the friction of fit. Not mortar. Just physics. Just a thing balanced perfectly in place by the force pressing on it from above and from the sides. She took her hand away. She stood back from the wall and looked at it. The stone sat exactly where it had always sat. You could stand in this barn for 30 years and never find it if you were not running your hand across every inch of the surface. And even then, you might stop an inch short or press a different way and miss it entirely. Someone had set it that way on purpose. That much was not a question. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened her notebook, wrote the height, the position, the measurements, drew the wall with a small mark at the stone's location, wrote nothing interpretive, only what she could measure. She did not pull it. She did not know yet what she had the right to open or what would be waiting on the other side of it. And she had learned enough in her work, enough from arriving too quickly at too many things, to understand that some moments ask you to stop and to prepare and to come back. She closed the notebook. Outside, she heard boots crossing the lot. The boots stopped outside the main door. She did not move from the wall. She heard him test the latch, the same 2-second pause he gave it every morning, as if he were deciding something. And then the door swung open, and the morning light came in with him. He looked at her once. She was standing at the western wall with her notebook closed and her hands at her sides, not writing, not measuring, not doing anything a person could name. He did not ask. He took in the room the way he always did, a slow pan from the rafters down, checking what had shifted overnight. And then he turned and walked to the east wall. She watched him. He crouched at the base of a board she had noticed on her first day. A split ran its full length, open 3/4 of an inch at the widest point, weathered gray at the edges from years of winter getting through. The kind of damage that did not affect a building coming down in 3 days. He set his bag on the floor, took out a pry bar, and began working the board free without any announcement of what he intended. She watched him for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she opened her notebook and turned back to the wall. She made herself look at the seam again. The hairline gap above the stone, the way it sat just slightly proud on the right side. She measured the height from the floor, 6 feet, 4 inches. She measured the width of the gap. She pressed her fingertips along the stone's edge again, not to move it, only to understand it better. She thought about what it would have taken to set it like that in 1846. To carry a stone that size to exact placement and set it without mortar. To engineer a fit so close that 37 years of settling had not opened the gap more than a blade's width. That was not the work of a man building carelessly. That was the work of a man who expected someone to come looking. Behind her, she heard the board come free with a dry crack. She did not turn around. She heard him set it aside, heard him run a hand along the exposed frame, heard the particular sound of someone finding exactly what they already suspected, and deciding without words how to address it. Then the measured tap of a hammer. Even. Unhurried. She wrote in her notebook, "Cavity access appears deliberate. Stone set by pressure and fit. No mortar. Intentional concealment probable." She had not written the word probable in her field notes in years. The word sat there on the page. The hammering continued behind her, regular as a clock. No one had asked him to fix that board. It was not in the demolition plan. It was not in anything. She let it be. Outside, the morning was burning off toward noon. She left him to the hammering and walked into town. The county clerk's office sat between the assayer and the post office. A narrow room with a single window that faced north and let in light the color of old paper. The clerk was a compact man in his 50s who moved through his files the way a man moves through a familiar house, without looking at his feet. She told him what she needed. The original survey. The 1846 filing for the barn parcel on the eastern edge. He did not ask why. She was county survey. It was her job to ask. He was gone less than 4 minutes and came back with a folder the color of a dry creek bed. She read it standing at his counter. The survey was precise in every other detail. Parcel dimensions, corner markers, distance to the road. The handwriting was small and regular, the kind a man develops after years of producing documents that have to hold up. Everything was notated correctly except one line near the bottom, where the barn's position was recorded relative to the lot boundary. Set per owner's instruction, that was all. No measurement, no explanation. No note of the 2-foot variance that any builder or contractor would have to account for Offutt variants that any builder or surveyor would have flagged. Just those 4 words in the same careful hand, and then the surveyor's signature beneath. She asked the clerk who had signed it. He looked. He read the name back to her. She asked if he had a record of that surveyor beyond this filing. The clerk went back to his files. She waited. Outside, a wagon passed. Someone called a name across the street. He returned with a single index card. The surveyor had filed 2 documents in Harlan Flats in the spring of 1846. This survey and one other, a routine road measurement east of town. Both filed the same week. No record after that, no forwarding address. The card noted simply, departed, date unknown, not returned. She wrote the name down. She wrote same week and underlined it once. She thanked the clerk, tucked the folder under her arm, and walked back. The carpenter was working on the east wall when she arrived. She did not stop to look at what he had done. She went inside, crossed to the southeast corner, and sat down on the floor with the folder open across her knees. The sound was there, low and patient. The floor breathing the way it always did in the mornings. But it was past noon now, and still the sound continued. She had stopped being surprised by it. She read the survey again in that light. Then she read it a 3rd time. Set per owner's instruction. The original builder had known exactly what he was doing. The surveyor had known too, or suspected enough that he had written nothing useful and left before anyone could ask him to. She looked at the line again. 4 words that had held this secret for 37 years. Outside, the hammer fell in its even rhythm. 2 days left. The sun had moved past the high window by the time she put the survey down. She stood, crossed to the western wall, and pressed her palm flat against the stone. She had done this twice before, once on the first morning, once the night she found the survey, and both times had pulled her hand back without knowing what she was looking for. Now she knew. She moved along the wall slowly, pressing every 3rd stone, feeling for the difference. It was not loose in the way she had expected. There was no wobble, no give at the edges. It was simply set. Placed without mortar between its neighbors, fitting so precisely that the absence of mortar read as craftsmanship rather than omission. She might have passed it 40 times and seen nothing. She had passed it 40 times and seen nothing. She got her fingers behind the lower edge. The stone came out heavier than its size suggested. She went down on one knee to manage it, slid it free, and set it on the floor beside her. The cavity behind it ran back farther than she could see in the low light. She went to her bag for the candle, lit it with a match from her coat pocket, and held it to the opening. 18 inches, maybe a little more. The walls of the cavity were dry. Whatever the builder had known about this place, he had known enough to line the inside with fitted flat stones that kept the moisture from the spring from reaching inward. 37 years, and the inside of that wall was as dry as a kept house. The tin box sat at the back. It was not large, small enough to have passed through the opening with room to spare, roughly the size of a surveyor's field book. The lid had been sealed with wax, dark brown now and brittle, cracked along one edge where it had contracted in the cold of some winter past. The box itself had gone the color of old leaves, but it was whole. She could see no rust at the seam. She reached in with both hands and drew it out. It was heavier than the size suggested. She held it level against her chest for a moment, the candle in her other hand. the western wall open and dark behind her. The sound came from the southeast corner, low and patient, the same as always. She did not open it. She carried it to the workbench near the door, set it down on the planks where the light was best, and stood looking at it for a moment. The wax along the lid edge, the faint, impressed mark in the tin where something had rested against it for years. Then she went outside. He was on the east wall, jacket off despite the cold, working a new board into a gap near the foundation. He did not look up when she stopped at the corner of the barn. She said, "I need you to come inside." He came without a word. She heard the board set down against the barn wall, a single clean sound, and then his boots in the grass, and then he was beside her at the doorway. She stepped back in, and he followed. The tin box sat on the workbench where she had left it. He stopped a few feet short of it, hands at his sides, and looked. The candle on the bench threw a warm, unsteady light across the surface of the tin, catching the seam, the cracked wax along the lid edge, the small, impressed mark in the metal where something had pressed against it for years in the dark. He did not touch it. She said, "The wall was built to hold it. Not as an accident. Not because someone ran short of stone. The cavity is finished. The edges are dressed. The false-set stone fits clean. Someone measured for it. Someone planned to put something inside it and seal it and leave it there." He looked at the box. She said, "The demolition crew arrives at dawn tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. The sound from the southeast corner came up through the floorboards, low and even, the water doing what it had always done. He said, "Tomorrow morning." She said yes. He stood there a moment longer. He reached out and touched the edge of the tin with 2 fingers, not lifting it, only confirming the weight of it, the reality of it. And then he let his hand fall. She did not say, "Open it now." She did not know yet why. Only that it felt wrong to open it in the afternoon with the work still undone and the hours still running. Only that whatever was inside had waited 37 years and could wait one more night. He seemed to understand this without her saying it. He looked once more at the lid, at the wax, at the small depression in the tin. Then he turned and walked back to the door. She heard him pick the board back up. She heard the first tap of the hammer, and then the second, settling into a steady rhythm against the east wall. She turned back to her survey table. The floor plan spread across it was nearly complete. Every beam, every stone, every shift in the foundation marked in pencil with the dates she could confirm. She picked up her pencil. The light through the western gap had started to soften. Another hour, maybe less, before it was gone. She worked across the page in careful lines, and outside the hammer continued its measured count. And between them the barn held the afternoon in the way old buildings hold the things they have been trusted with. Not tightly, only steadily, the way good work holds. The box sat on the workbench. The candle burned down another 1/4 inch. The sound of the spring was faint and continuous, beneath everything else. The light went first from the western gap, then from the high cut in the north wall, and then the barn was holding only what the candle gave it. She set her pencil down and listened. The sound was easier to find in the dark, not louder, just less competed with. She crossed to the southeast corner and crouched, pressing one hand flat against the floorboard. The wood was cold and slightly damp. She could feel it before she could fully hear it. A faint, continuous tremor moving up through the grain. not the settling of old timber, not the wind finding a gap. Something underneath, patient and indifferent, running the way water runs when nothing has stopped it in a very long time. She moved her hand 6 inches south, still there, 6 inches east, still there. She took out her survey notes and drew a circle in the southeast corner of the floor plan, not approximate, as close to exact as she could measure in the available light. She wrote beside it, "Spring, consistent, not a seep, running at depth, audible through flooring at approximately 4 feet from southeast corner post." Then she sat back on her heels and stayed there a moment. The candle threw a long shadow across the floor plan. The box sat on the workbench where she had left it. The barn was quiet except for the sound she had just written down. She pulled a second sheet from her survey case. This one was not a floor plan. She wrote the date at the top, the correct date, the real one, 2 days before the demolition order. She wrote her name and her county appointment in the line below. Then she began. Petition for temporary halt of demolition order. Harlan Flats Parcel 14E. She wrote slowly and with care, choosing each word the way you choose a stone for a foundation. Not for how it sounds, but for how much weight it will hold. She wrote about the sealed cavity. She wrote about the documents, still sealed inside the box, which she described in the careful language of apparent deed instrument and associated correspondence, pending examination. She wrote about the spring. She wrote about the land record discrepancy the spring's location implied. She did not open the box. Not yet. The petition did not require her to. It only required her to establish sufficient reason for a court to pause. She had sufficient reason. She finished, read it back twice, changed 3 words, and set it on top of her survey case. First light, she would ride to the clerk's office. One day, left before the crews arrived. She blew out the candle and sat another moment in the dark, listening to the water run beneath her feet. She was at the clerk's office before the lock turned. The clerk came around the corner with his coat half buttoned and his keys in his hand, and nearly walked into her on the step. He looked at the papers she was holding, and then at her face, and did not say anything for a moment. Inside, he set his hat on the hook and sat down. She placed the petition on the counter without preamble. He unfolded it and read it through, and she watched his eyes move across the lines. He got to the part about the spring and stopped, read it again. He looked at her over his glasses. He said he could not guarantee a response before the crews arrived in the morning. The circuit judge was in Pueblo. A rider would have to go today, and the judge would have to read it and sign it. And the rider would have to come back, and all of that would have to happen inside of 1 day. She said she knew. He held her gaze another second. Then he took out his receiving stamp and pressed it to the top sheet and wrote the date and the time beside it in his cramped, careful hand. He handed her the carbon copy. She folded it and put it inside her coat. Outside, the sky was the pale gray of early morning, the sun not yet over the ridge. She walked back down the main street and past the livery, where the doors were already open, and the smell of hay and horses came out into the cold air. She did not stop. The barn sat at the edge of town in the low light, its shadow long across the field. From 50 feet away, she could hear the sound of a hammer. He was on the north wall. He had moved from the east, and the east wall was done. She could see it as she came around the corner, the boards tight and even, the gaps filled. the whole face of it solid in a way it had not been 3 days ago. He had worked all morning already, or perhaps he had started before dawn. She did not ask. He glanced back when he heard her footsteps on the frozen ground. He read something in the way she was walking. He turned back to the wall and set another nail. She set her survey case down on the rail. She looked at the east wall for a long moment, at the work that had been done quietly and without announcement across the whole of the week. Then she went inside to the southeast corner and stood still and listened to the water running beneath the floor. She came back out to where he was working and said simply, "Come inside." He looked at her once. Then he set the hammer on the rail, handle out, and followed. They crossed the floor to the western wall without speaking. She knelt and pressed her palm to the false-set stone, the one that had no mortar, only weight and fit and 37 years of staying put. He crouched beside her. Between them there was perhaps a foot of cold air. She worked the stone loose. He steadied it as it came free. The tin box was where it had always been. She lifted it out and set it on the floor between them. The latch was stiff. He worked it with his thumbnail until it gave. Inside, a bundle of 11 letters, folded and tied with a strip of leather that had dried to the color of bark. And beneath them, a single folded sheet, thicker paper, the kind a surveyor would use, which, when she opened it, showed a hand-drawn plot in faded ink. A boundary line, a small mark indicating water. A date in the upper right corner, 1846. She held it flat in both hands and read it through once. The deed described a freshwater spring and the surrounding quarter-acre. It described who the land belonged to, a Cheyenne family, named, with markers she did not recognize, but that were clearly landmarks, clearly real, clearly recorded by someone who had looked at the place and written down what they saw. The builder had signed it himself, below, as witness. She handed it to him and picked up the letters. They had been written in the same hand as the witness signature. Careful, unhurried cursive that pressed harder on the downstrokes. She did not read them aloud. He did not ask her to. He read the deed in full and then held it without moving. The letters said what had been done and why. They said the family had been displaced in 1857. They said the spring was the reason, a water source that made the surrounding land valuable once someone wanted it to be. They said the barn had been built off-center on purpose, the western wall placed to enclose the spring within the footprint, to preserve the physical fact of it for a future moment that the builder had known might not come in his lifetime. He had been right about that. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. The barn shifted once, slowly, a low sound from somewhere in the timbers above them. Not distress, something closer to acknowledgement. She folded the deed and set it on top of the letters and held them both in her lap. Neither of them spoke. She filed the documents that morning before the light had fully lifted, walking the 3 blocks to the county clerk's office with the deed and the letters wrapped in cloth and held under her arm. The clerk was unlocking the door when she arrived. He looked at what she put on his counter and looked at her and looked at the deed again. He sent for the judge. The judge came without breakfast. By 8 o'clock, there was a stamped order sitting on the clerk's desk and a rider saddling up at the livery. She walked back to the barn. He was at the north wall. He had been there since first light, working the last section of new board into place, and he did not look up when she came through the door. She poured what was left in the coffee pot into a cup and stood at the entrance to the eastern corridor and listened to the sound of his hammer. Regular, patient, the same tempo it had held all week. She did not tell him about the rider. She did not tell him what was on the road. She stood with her cup and listened, and after a while she stopped listening to the hammer and started listening to the barn itself. The way the air moved through it differently now, or the same as it always had. She could not have said which. The rider found the crew an hour east of town. She heard about this later. The foreman read the order twice, folded it, handed it back, and turned the wagons around without argument. He had been in this country long enough to know what a court stamp meant and what it cost to ignore one. She was still at the door when she heard them. Not the crew, just the absence of what she had been waiting for, the sound of wagons that did not come. The road stayed empty. The dust at the horizon did not rise. Behind her, the hammer stopped. She heard him cross the barn floor. She heard him set the hammer down on the rail beside her cup. Not dropped, not placed with ceremony, just set there, metal on wood, the small, definitive sound of a thing finding its resting place. Then his footsteps going back. She stood at the threshold with the empty road in front of her, and the sound of the spring beneath the floor somewhere behind her, and his hammer beside her cup on the rail. The morning held. The barn held. She did not turn around, and she did not move for a long time, and the road stayed clear and open all the way to the edge of what she could see.